The autumn evening settled over London like a velvet curtain, and, inside the Grand Royal Opera House, anticipation crackled through the air with electric intensity. Tonight was different from the usual royal engagements that filled Prince William and Catherine's calendar. Tonight, they weren't simply cutting ribbons or shaking hands with dignitaries. They were about to witness something that would shake them to their very core. The Prince of Wales adjusted his black tie one final time as their car pulled up to the entrance. Through the tinted windows, he could see the familiar flash of cameras and the excited chatter of the crowd gathered behind the barriers. Catherine sat beside him, elegant in midnight blue, her fingers unconsciously fidgeting with her pearl bracelet. Neither of them spoke, but both felt an unusual tension that had nothing to do with the usual pre-event nerves. They were here for the annual Shakespeare Foundation Awards, an evening dedicated to celebrating contemporary interpretations of the Bard's work. What made this year special was the premiere performance of a new adaptation that had already sent shockwaves through London's theatre community. The whispers had reached even the palace walls. This wasn't going to be your typical Shakespearean evening. As they stepped from the car, William caught Catherine's eye. She gave him that small, knowing smile that had gotten them through countless public appearances, but tonight it seemed more fragile than usual. They had been briefed about the evening's main attraction, but briefings could never truly prepare anyone for what they were about to experience. The red carpet stretched before them like a river of crimson silk, lined with reporters and photographers whose cameras created a constellation of flashing lights. William placed his hand gently on the small of Catherine's back as they began their walk. The questions flew at them from all directions, but tonight the usual inquiries about their children and upcoming engagements seemed somehow trivial. Inside the Opera House, the atmosphere was thick with expectation. The cream of London's cultural elite filled the ornate seats, their conversations creating a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. William and Catherine were escorted to the royal box, where they settled into the plush red velvet chairs that had hosted countless generations of their family. The program in Catherine's hands felt heavier than usual as she opened it. There, on the first page, was a single haunting image, a child's toy soldier, abandoned and broken. Above it, in elegant script, were the words Hamnet, a father's lament. She felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. William leaned closer to read over her shoulder, and she could feel his breath catch slightly. They both understood, in that moment, that this wasn't going to be entertainment in the traditional sense. This was going to be something far more personal, far more devastating. The director of the Shakespeare Foundation, a distinguished woman in her 60s named Margaret Thornfield, approached their box with obvious nervousness. She had specifically requested this meeting before the performance began, though she hadn't explained why over the phone. "Your Royal Highnesses," she began, her voice carrying a tremor that seemed unusual for someone of her experience and stature. "I wanted to speak with you before the performance begins. This interpretation of Hamnet, it's unlike anything we've presented before." Catherine set down her program, giving Margaret her full attention. "In what way?" Margaret's hands clasped and unclasped as she chose her words carefully. "The playwright has taken extraordinary liberties with the source material. While Shakespeare's Hamnet dies young in historical accounts, this adaptation explores what his death might have meant to a father. It's extraordinarily raw." William felt something cold settle in his stomach. As a father of 3 young children, he had learned to compartmentalize certain fears, to push away the thoughts that could paralyze any parent if dwelt upon too long. Tonight, it seemed, those carefully constructed walls might be tested. "The performance includes audience participation," Margaret continued, her voice growing even more hesitant. "Not in a traditional sense, but the actor portraying Shakespeare will address the audience directly. He may even single out members of the audience for interaction." Catherine's fingers found William's hand, and he could feel the slight tremor in her touch. They had been warned about interactive elements, but something in Margaret's tone suggested this would be far more intense than they had imagined. As Margaret excused herself and returned to her duties, William and Catherine sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the theatre continued to fill with London's cultural elite, but the couple felt increasingly isolated in their understanding of what was to come. The lights began to dim, and conversations gradually faded to whispers, then to complete silence. The heavy burgundy curtains remained closed, but from somewhere behind them came the sound of a single violin, playing a melody so achingly beautiful and sorrowful that several members of the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Catherine's grip on William's hand tightened as a single spotlight illuminated the center of the stage. The curtains parted slowly, revealing not an elaborate set, but a simple wooden table, a chair, and a pile of manuscripts scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Then, he appeared. The actor who would portray William Shakespeare was not what anyone expected. He wasn't the typical theatrical interpretation of the bard, no elaborate costume, no affected mannerisms. Instead, he was dressed simply, in clothes that could have belonged to any modern father. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed with grief so authentic that several audience members leaned forward in their seats. When he spoke, his voice carried across the theater with the kind of raw honesty that made everyone present feel as though they were intruding on a private moment of agony. "Hamnet," he said simply, and the name hung in the air like a prayer or a curse. The actor moved to the scattered papers on the floor, kneeling among them as though they were the remnants of a shattered life. "My boy. My beautiful, impossible boy." William felt Catherine's breathing change beside him, becoming shallower, more careful. He understood why. Every parent in that theater was suddenly thinking of their own children, tucked safely in their beds at home, or perhaps not so safely, because life offered no guarantees, no matter how much love you poured into protecting them. The performance had barely begun, and already the atmosphere in the theater had shifted dramatically. This wasn't going to be a comfortable evening of cultural appreciation. This was going to be an endurance test of emotional fortitude. The actor stood slowly, his movements deliberate and heavy with grief. When he looked out into the audience, his gaze seemed to find every parent present, seemed to speak directly to their deepest, most carefully hidden fears. "You think you know loss," he said, his voice carrying easily through the perfect acoustics of the opera house. "You think you understand what it means to love something so completely that its absence could destroy you." Several members of the audience shifted uncomfortably. This level of direct address was unusual, even in experimental theater. "But you don't know," the actor continued, beginning to pace the small stage like a caged animal. "You can't know until you've held your child's fever-hot hand and felt it grow cold. Until you've whispered stories into ears that will never hear another tale." Catherine's free hand moved unconsciously to her chest, where her heart had begun beating with uncomfortable intensity. Beside her, William sat perfectly still, his training in public appearances warring with the very human urge to flee from this unexpected emotional assault. The actor moved to the simple wooden table and picked up one of the scattered manuscripts. "They want me to write comedies," he said, his voice thick with bitter irony. "They want laughter and romance and happy endings. They don't understand that every word I write now is a letter to a boy who will never read it." The silence in the theater was complete now, broken only by the occasional soft intake of breath from the audience. Even the usual rustling of programs and settling into seats had ceased entirely. "Hamnet Shakespeare," the actor continued, holding the manuscript against his chest like a shield. 11 years old when the fever took him. 11 years of laughter and questions and sticky fingers on my papers. 11 years of a voice calling father, that I will never hear again. William closed his eyes briefly, and unbidden came the voices of his own children, George's serious questions about everything and nothing, Charlotte's infectious giggle, Louis's delighted shrieks during their games. The thought of silence where those voices should be was almost unbearable. The actor seemed to sense the shift in his audience's emotional state, and his performance intensified accordingly. This wasn't acting in any traditional sense, this was channeling, this was becoming the embodiment of every parent's worst nightmare. "I write King Lear and I see only Hamnet in Cordelia's devotion," he said, moving among the scattered papers again. "I write Macbeth and I understand perfectly why a man would kill to protect what he loves. I write The Tempest and I know that every father is Prospero, trying to control the uncontrollable, trying to keep his children safe in a world that cares nothing for a parent's love." The performance continued for another hour, growing in intensity with each passing moment. The actor's portrayal of grief was so authentic, so completely consuming, that the line between performance and reality began to blur for everyone present. When the first act finally ended and the lights came up for intermission, the theater was filled with an unusual silence. Typically, intermission at cultural events was a time for socializing, for discussing the performance over champagne and canapés. Tonight, however, most of the audience sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just experienced. William and Catherine remained in their seats as well-meaning acquaintances approached their box to make polite conversation. But their responses were automatic, their minds still trapped in the world the actor had created, a world where love and loss were inextricably intertwined, where every moment of parental joy contained the seed of potential devastation. As the lights dimmed again and the second act began, neither of them realized that the evening had only just begun, and that what awaited them in the final act would challenge everything they thought they knew about performance, about grief, and about the terrible, beautiful vulnerability of loving someone more than life itself. The second act began not with the gentle violin melody that had opened the evening, but with complete silence. The stage remained exactly as it had been left, with scattered manuscripts and the simple wooden furniture, but now there was something different in the air. The silence itself seemed to breathe with anticipation and dread. William found himself holding his breath as the actor who portrayed Shakespeare returned to the stage. During the intermission, the man seemed to have aged years. His shoulders were more bent, his movements more labored, as though the weight of grief had physically settled upon him like a heavy cloak. Catherine noticed that her hands had begun to shake slightly, and she pressed them firmly together in her lap. Around them, the audience had returned to their seats with an unusual solemnity. The typical intermission chatter about the weather and social plans had been replaced by hushed conversations about children, about the fragility of life, about fears that most parents kept buried deep in their hearts. The actor moved to center stage and stood for a long moment, simply breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried perfectly through the acoustically perfect space. "The second fever came in winter," he said, and every parent in the audience felt their blood turn cold. "You think the first one prepared you. You think you know what to expect." He began to move among the scattered papers again, but this time his movements were different. Where before there had been frantic energy in his grief, now there was a terrible stillness, the kind that comes when someone has moved beyond mere sorrow into something far more dangerous. "But the second fever is different," he continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality that drew every listener deeper into his world. "The second fever comes with knowledge. It comes with the understanding that all your prayers, all your bargaining with God, all your desperate promises mean nothing when death decides to visit your house." Catherine's breathing had become shallow and deliberate. She found herself thinking of George's last cold, how she had checked on him throughout the night, her hand on his forehead, counting his breaths. The memory, which had been merely a moment of maternal concern at the time, now felt laden with terrible possibility. The actor picked up one of the manuscripts from the floor, holding it delicately as though it might crumble at his touch. "I was writing Hamlet when Hamnet died," he said, and the irony in his voice was so bitter it seemed to contaminate the very air around him. "Hamlet, whose name echoes my son's like a cruel joke from the universe itself." He began to read from the manuscript in his hands, but these weren't the familiar words of Shakespeare's famous play. These were different words, rawer words, words that felt like they had been torn from a father's breaking heart. "To be or not to be," he said, but the famous soliloquy had been transformed into something else entirely. "That is the question I ask not for myself, but for you, my boy. To be, in a world without your laughter, or not to be, in this emptiness that your absence has created." William felt something tighten in his chest, a physical reaction to words that seemed designed to reach directly into a parent's deepest fears. He glanced sideways at Catherine and saw that her eyes had filled with tears she was fighting not to shed. The actor set down the manuscript and moved to the simple wooden chair. When he sat, he seemed to collapse into it rather than simply taking a seat. The movement was so authentic, so completely without theatrical artifice, that several audience members shifted forward in their seats, as though witnessing a private moment they shouldn't be seeing. "They tell you that grief gets easier," he said, his voice now carrying a conversational tone that somehow made his words even more devastating. "They tell you that time heals all wounds, that you'll learn to carry the loss, that you'll find meaning in the tragedy." He looked up at the audience then, and his gaze seemed to find every person present, seemed to speak directly to each individual heart. "They're lying," he said simply. "Or perhaps they've never loved anyone the way a parent loves a child. Perhaps they'd never experienced the particular brand of devastation that comes when the future you've imagined, the future you've built every dream around, simply ceases to exist. The temperature in the theater seemed to have dropped several degrees. William found himself thinking about his official duties as Prince of Wales, about the constitutional requirements that would one day fall to George. But, underneath those formal considerations was something far more fundamental, the simple, overwhelming love he felt for his son, and the terrible vulnerability that love created. The actor stood again, moving to the edge of the stage where the footlights created harsh shadows across his face. For the first time since the performance began, he looked directly up at the royal box where William and Catherine sat. "Your Majesty," he said, and, though he was addressing William with the formal title he wouldn't actually hold until his father's death, the words carried none of the usual deference. Instead, they carried the equality of shared parenthood, the recognition that grief and love recognize no rank or privilege. Catherine's hand found William's again, and, this time both of them were trembling slightly. This was unprecedented in their experience of official engagements. Performers might acknowledge their presence, might even dedicate a performance to them, but they didn't typically address them directly during the performance itself. "You sit there in your fine clothes, in your position of safety and privilege," the actor continued, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the theater. "But you're not a prince right now. Right now, you're just a father, sitting in the dark, being reminded of how little control you actually have over the things that matter most." William felt heat rise in his face, not from embarrassment but from the shock of recognition. The actor was right. Stripped of all the trappings of royal protocol, he was indeed just a father, and fathers everywhere lived with the same fundamental terror that something might happen to their children. The actor's gaze shifted to Catherine. "And you, your Royal Highness, you understand, don't you? You understand the way love can become a weapon turned against your own heart. The way every moment of joy with your children is shadowed by the knowledge that this happiness isn't guaranteed, that it could be taken away in a fever, in an accident, in any of 1,000 ways that keep parents awake at night." Catherine's training in public appearances warred with her human instincts. Every fiber of her being wanted to flee from this unexpected emotional assault, but her duty required her to remain composed, to represent the dignity of the crown even in the face of this unprecedented artistic confrontation. The actor seemed to sense her internal struggle, and something in his expression softened slightly. "I don't mean to be cruel," he said, his voice returning to the more general address of the entire audience. "I only mean to remind us all that beneath every role we play, beneath every title we hold, we are all just human beings trying to protect what we love most in a world that offers no guarantees." He returned to the scattered manuscripts, kneeling among them once more. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute exhaustion. "I tried to write him back to life," he said, picking up paper after paper, letting them fall from his fingers like autumn leaves. "Every play, every sonnet, every silly verse I scribbled in the margins of other people's work. I thought if I could just find the right words, if I could just arrange them in the perfect order, I could somehow undo what had been done." The performance continued for another 30 minutes, each moment more emotionally brutal than the last. The actor's portrayal of grief was so complete, so utterly authentic, that the line between performance and reality had completely dissolved. The audience was no longer watching a play about Shakespeare's loss, they were witnessing a father's complete emotional breakdown, made public and transformed into art. When the actor finally collapsed among the scattered papers, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul, the silence in the theater was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed, no one dared break the spell that had been cast over them all. Catherine realized that tears were streaming down her face, and she made no attempt to wipe them away. Beside her, William sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the stage where the actor lay surrounded by the remnants of imaginary plays that had failed to bring back a dead child. The lights began to dim slowly, so slowly that the transition from illumination to darkness took several minutes. As the stage grew darker, the actor's sobs gradually quieted, until finally, there was nothing but complete darkness and complete silence. The audience sat in that darkness for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. No one applauded, no one moved, no one seemed to know how to respond to what they had just witnessed. When the lights finally came up for the second intermission, the transformation in the theater was palpable. Where earlier there had been the usual social energy of a cultural event, now there was something closer to the atmosphere of a wake. People spoke in hushed tones, if they spoke at all. Many remained in their seats, staring at the stage that now stood empty except for those scattered papers that seemed to represent the fragments of a shattered life. William and Catherine remained in their box, but neither spoke. They were both processing what they had experienced, trying to understand how a theatrical performance had managed to penetrate so deeply into their most private fears and vulnerabilities. Margaret Thornfield approached their box again, her face pale and drawn. "Your Royal Highnesses," she began hesitantly, "I want you to know that the final act, it's even more intense than what you've seen. If you would prefer to leave now, no one would think less of you for it." William looked at Catherine, and she met his gaze with the same determination he had seen in her eyes on their wedding day, when she had committed to a life in the public eye, knowing full well the scrutuses and challenges it would bring. "No," Catherine said quietly. "We'll stay." As the lights dimmed once more and the final act began, neither of them realized that what they were about to witness would haunt them for years to come, would change the way they looked at their own children, and would give them a deeper understanding of both the terrible beauty and the devastating fragility of love itself. The final act began not on the stage, but in the audience itself. As the lights dimmed for the last time, the actor who had embodied Shakespeare's grief so completely appeared not behind the footlights, but walking slowly down the center aisle of the theater, moving among the seated patrons like a ghost seeking solace among the living. William felt his entire body tense as he realized what was happening. This wasn't going to be a traditional conclusion to their evening of theater. This was going to be something far more personal, far more dangerous to their carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. The actor moved slowly through the orchestra section, occasionally stopping beside certain audience members, sometimes placing a gentle hand on someone's shoulder, sometimes simply standing quietly nearby. Each person he approached seemed to shrink slightly, as though his proximity brought them face to face with their own mortality, their own deepest fears about loss and love. Catherine watched this progression with growing dread, understanding instinctively that this movement through the audience wasn't random. The actor was making his way toward them, toward the royal box, with the deliberate purpose of someone who had planned this moment from the very beginning. When he finally reached the stairs leading up to their box, he paused and looked directly at them both. In his eyes, they could see not the calculation of a performer, but the raw authenticity of someone who had genuinely channeled the deepest possible grief. This wasn't acting anymore, if it ever had been. This was something far more real and far more frightening. "May I?" he asked quietly, gesturing toward the entrance to their box. William's training and protocol warred with something deeper, something more human. Every instinct told him to maintain the dignified distance that royal appearances required, but the evening had stripped away so many of the usual barriers between performer and audience that such distance now seemed not just artificial but actually cruel. He nodded slightly, and the actor stepped into their box, moving with the careful reverence of someone entering a sacred space. The entire theater held its breath, watching this unprecedented breach of royal protocol unfold in real time. The actor sat in the empty chair beside Catherine, and, when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that only they could hear him. The rest of the audience watched in fascination and growing discomfort, witnessing something they knew they shouldn't be seeing, yet unable to look away. "Tell me about your children," he said simply, and the request was so unexpected, so completely outside the bounds of normal royal interactions, that Catherine felt herself responding before her training could intercede. "George is 8, she heard herself saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "He asks questions about everything. He wants to understand how the world works, why people make the choices they make." The actor nodded, and something in his expression suggested he was genuinely listening, not performing for the audience that watched from below. "Charlotte is 6, Catherine continued, surprised by her own willingness to share these intimate details in such a public setting. "She's fearless in a way that terrifies me sometimes. She climbs too high, runs too fast, trusts too easily." "And your youngest?" the actor prompted gently. William found his voice, though it came out rougher than he had intended. "Louis is 4. He's pure joy. Everything delights him. A butterfly, a puddle, the way shadows move across the wall. He sees magic everywhere." The actor closed his eyes for a moment, and, when he opened them again, they were bright with tears that seemed entirely genuine. Hamnet was like that, he said, and, though he was speaking to William and Catherine, his voice carried clearly enough for the entire theater to hear. Everything was an adventure. Every day was full of discoveries. He would bring me beetles and broken bird eggs and smooth stones from the river, convinced that each one was a treasure beyond imagining. Catherine felt her own tears starting again, and this time she made no attempt to stop them. The vulnerability of this moment, the complete abandonment of the usual royal reserve, felt both terrifying and somehow necessary. The actor reached into his jacket and withdrew something small, something that caught the light from the theater's chandeliers. It was a child's toy, a small wooden horse that had been worn smooth by countless small hands. This was his, the actor said, holding the toy horse with infinite tenderness. He carried it everywhere. It went to bed with him, came to the market with us, sat beside his plate at every meal. He held the toy out toward William and Catherine, and, after a moment's hesitation, Catherine extended her hands to receive it. The wood was indeed worn smooth, polished by years of loving handling, and she could feel the weight of history in the simple object. After he died, the actor continued, I couldn't bear to see it. And put it away with his other things, but I knew it was there, waiting. It seemed like an accusation, a reminder of all the games we would never play, all the adventures we would never have. William found himself staring at the toy horse in Catherine's hands, thinking about the countless toys scattered throughout their own homes, the evidence of his children's presence that he had always taken for granted. The actor looked out at the audience, and, when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who had traveled to the very depths of human experience and returned with hard-won wisdom. You think you love them now, he said, addressing not just William and Catherine but every parent in the theater. You think you understand the depth of your own devotion. But you don't know. You can't know until you've lost them. The silence that followed this statement was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of people trying to control their breathing, their emotions, their sudden awareness of how precious and precarious their own happiness truly was. The actor turned back to William and Catherine. But, here's what I learned, what took me years to understand, he said, his voice growing stronger, more certain. The love doesn't diminish. The love doesn't end just because they're gone. The love becomes something else, something that exists outside of time, outside of presence, outside of all the normal rules that govern human emotion. Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, as though a door she hadn't known existed was slowly opening. The toy horse in her hands seemed to pulse with warmth, with life, with all the love that had been poured into it by a child who was gone but somehow still present in this small wooden token. Every play I wrote after Hamnet died was a letter to him, the actor continued. Every sonnet was a bedtime story for a boy who would never hear another story. Every word was an act of love, a refusal to let death have the final say. He gestured toward the scattered manuscripts that still lay across the stage below them. That's what we do with grief, if we're lucky. We transform it into something that honors what we've lost. We make art from our anguish, beauty from our brokenness. William found himself thinking about his own role, his own future responsibilities, and, for the first time he understood them not as burdens inherited from history, but as acts of love for children who would inherit the world he helped to shape. The actor stood slowly, and Catherine realized she was reluctant to give back the toy horse, reluctant to break this connection to a grief that was centuries old but felt immediate and present. Keep it, the actor said gently, as though reading her thoughts. Not as a reminder of loss, but as a reminder of love. As a reminder that every moment you have with them is precious beyond measure, not because it might be taken away, but because it exists at all. He moved toward the edge of their box, preparing to return to the stage for the final moments of the performance. But, before he left, he turned back one more time. The award tonight, he said, it's not for me. It's for everyone who has loved someone so much that the thought of losing them feels like death itself. It's for everyone who gets up each morning and chooses to love anyway, despite knowing how much it can hurt. The actor returned to the stage, and the final minutes of the performance unfolded in a space transformed by what had just occurred. The usual boundaries between performer and audience, between art and life, had been completely dissolved. Everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented, something that would stay with them far longer than any traditional theatrical experience. When the performance finally ended, the response was unlike anything William and Catherine had ever experienced at a cultural event. There was no immediate applause, no rush to stand and show appreciation. Instead, there was a long moment of profound silence, as though everyone present was reluctant to break the spell that had been cast over them. When applause finally did come, it was different from the usual polite appreciation that marked most royal cultural engagements. This was something deeper, something that acknowledged not just artistic achievement but emotional truth, not just entertainment but transformation. As William and Catherine prepared to leave their box for the traditional post-performance reception, Catherine still clutched the small wooden horse in her hands. The toy had become more than a prop from a play, it had become a talisman, a reminder of the conversation they had just experienced, a physical representation of love's ability to transcend even death itself. The reception that followed was subdued compared to the usual post-theater social events. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Parents spoke to each other with a new awareness of their shared vulnerabilities, their shared blessings. The usual social pleasantries seemed somehow inadequate after what everyone had experienced together. When William and Catherine finally returned home that night, they found themselves moving quietly through their house, checking on their sleeping children with a new awareness of how precious these ordinary moments truly were. George sleeping peacefully with a book still open beside him, Charlotte sprawled across her bed with her arms flung wide in the complete abandonment of childhood sleep, Louis curled up with his favorite stuffed animal, his face peaceful and perfect in the soft glow from the hallway light. Catherine placed the wooden horse on her dressing table, where it would catch the morning light each day and remind her of the evening when she learned that love, real love, is always an act of courage in the face of uncertainty. Years later, when historians would write about this evening, they would note it as a turning point in how the royal family engaged with the arts, how they allowed themselves to be vulnerable in public spaces, how they demonstrated that even those born to privilege and protocol are, at their core, simply human beings trying to protect and cherish what matters most. But William and Catherine would remember it differently. They would remember it as the night they learned that love is not diminished by the possibility of loss, but made more precious by it. They would remember it as the night a centuries-old grief taught them something new about their own hearts, their own capacity for both joy and sorrow, their own place in the long human story of loving someone more than life itself. The wooden horse remained on Catherine's dressing table for the rest of her life, a daily reminder that every morning with her children was a gift, that every goodnight kiss was an act of faith, and that love, once given truly, becomes eternal, outlasting even the fragile bodies that first gave it form.